Okay, so there is a little bit of a debate in about like Gothic, that people disagree when they're pronouncing Gothic, whether they're going to pronounce like a and o as like well the digraphs that are written ai and au, like how are they pronounced in Gothic? Um, there's a disagreement about whether they should always be pronounced a, o, or whether they should sometimes be pronounced I, ow. So, first let's talk about like the origins of this like a, o. So, first of all, in inherited words, inherited from Proto-Germanic, there are three sources of a, o. The first is the result of I, E, or U before R, H, or Hua. So, Proto-Germanic Ferinona becomes Ferinon, Ferhus becomes Ferhus, Sehuana becomes Sehuan, Gedruchtis becomes Gedrocht, Gedrocht. It's kind of hard to say, but obviously I'm not a native Gothic speaker. I try my best though. Burgs becomes Borgt, a Borgs, something like that, with this aw. And we also have um, when e or u, uh, well, what becomes a and u in Gothic is believed to have been all in Proto-Germanic. So, but those typically become e, u, and not all. But before a vowel, they do become all. Um, in stressed syllables. So there are like some places where you get e, o even before a vowel, and some loan words. But we'll get to we'll talk about loan words at least, and then we have the thing that this discussion is actually about. This I ow from Proto-Germanic. So Proto-Germanic had Icona, which becomes Icon or icon if you're pronouncing it with a diphthong. So you have like there's and as you can see, so some people might be confused. They think, oh well, if I see I ow before r h or hua, then it must be short. But actually, it can sometimes be this, former diphthong. Um, so you can have gors or like gors, or however that's pronounced, from Gauraz, and Fehas, Fehs from Fehas. And so just because you see an H, an R, or a where, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was always, that it was never a diphthong, that it's short. Could be long as well. It could be so when it's from a diphthong, it's long. When it's just from eh, ooh, it's short. We also see this from Greek and Latin. It can be pretty hard to distinguish Greek and Latin loanwords. Most loanwords would be Greek. Even if they're originally from Latin, they would probably go through Greek first. But there are some words that seem to come from Latin, and you can't really tell by looking at it which one it's from. So we have this, which is from short e, o, in both Greek and Latin. Um, how exactly it's pronounced in Greek, it you could say it more like e, o, with a short vowel, but it's still written with with this like so this would be hevre hevreus with a long but a short here, and this would be something like di diaco diakonos, something like that. I'm not too good at like pronouncing these foreign words, these like Greek Latin words. Um, so these are all pronounced almost the same in all of these languages because they're like borrowed from each other, and they Greek, Latin, and Gothic all have similar phonologies. We also see this what's I think it's called Ash in English, and this AI in Greek. Originally, these were pronounced I and I, something like that. So in like classical Latin, you would have Caesar, and Greek would have like Caesar, something like that. However, these monophthongized in both Greek and Latin independently, so you get um, Caesar and Greek also Caesar, and that's what we get in Gothic. We get Caesar. Um, like I said, etymologically, it used to be I, but uh, Gothic is not spoken at the same time as Classical Latin or Classical Greek. It's spoken at the same time as Late Latin and Koine Greek. So that's just an important thing to note whenever you're learning words from Greek or Latin, is you might be tempted to loan them as if they were from Classical Latin and Classical Greek. But the loan words that we have attested don't typically resemble Classical Greek or Latin. They tend to resemble this like late Latin and Koine Greek. So here we have this what's written in Gothic as "ow," but would have come from "ow," like in Paulus and 𝐷𝐰𝐹thia. Um, you might notice, like in Gothic, here has a TS written because this is from Late Latin. Gothic was spoken at the same time as Late Latin, so we get this T, 𝐷𝐼𝐹thio, and we have Paulus from uh, promptly through Greek, and but from like originally Latin Paulus, and this is probably pronounced Paulus as opposed to Paulus, um, just because it's written AW, so that's probably a vowel followed by a consonant rather than a vowel followed by another vowel. We do have some evidence from Latin, um, very little because we only have like what's like what people like mainly names of like rulers, and also we have like the names of we have like Ostrogoths with an O. I think it's also sometimes spelled like Ostrogoths. Um, but we also have this 𝐷𝐰𝐹thia, which would presumably be 𝐷𝐼𝐹 in Proto-Germanic, but here in Gothic we have 𝐷𝐼𝐹thia. That may have been Vandalic, it's not exactly clear, but it shows there was like some uh, monophthongization. Uh, we have, like I said, these names, and we don't have the names written down in Gothic, so it's hard to say what they would have been. But like I said, this Ostrogoths would have been o- Os Ostrohutans. Elric may have come from Elrics. Widigas, maybe Widigas, and Gezelek, maybe from Gezelex. So we do have like some indication that there was monophthongization. There may have been The evidence sort of indicates that like there may have been like dialects that preserve the diphthongs from Proto-Germanic. Um, but it's difficult to tell sometimes whether something like came from like Frankish or like some other language, or it is like hard to tell for a lot of this, but the evidence does seem to suggest that there were like dialects of Visigothic or whatever that did preserve the diphthongs. So basically, this like gives us two possible systems. We have the diphthongal pronunciation I, ow, and the monophthongal pronunciation o. Now, you can see like Gothic does not like distinguish short vowels from long vowels most of the time. The only time it does is with and e, which was something that Greek sort of did. E was pronounced like this ei was pronounced e in Koine Greek, and but you get things like uh, Dawid, like which in Greek is just written with an I, but in Gothic it's ei because the I is long. So long I becomes like it actually gets written in Gothic as opposed to just being a long I or a I can't even remember the name of the Greek letter but it doesn't matter for this video. I haven't really studied Greek that much, but for can also be for u can also be u, for and even for and o, we have the short, which is from the short vowel, and the long, which is from the long vowel. There's no reason to just like we just have a and o, and there's no short a o in Gothic. Um, like I said, we do have ow from like in Paulus and Cautio. Um, that would suggest that like why are they writing that if it's from a diphthong? You could sort of argue that maybe it's like, oh, well, it's a foreign word, so they want to write the sound that they don't distinguish in native words, because, like a Goth would just know that it's ow versus you know. Um, but you could just write it like that in native words as well. You could just write it with the W. So why you wouldn't? Uh, we do have one uh like we have one digraph that has uh like a diphthongal pronunciation. Most people would say, and that's ew. So in words like theudha, like theudha, and lots of words like nuya, new. Um, so there is like some precedent for writing a diphthong uh, with like two vowel letters, as opposed to it's not written IW, except in places where it's not stressed, which would or where it comes before a vowel, and that would suggest that it's actually a difference in pronunciation. So this ew like ew versus ew. I'm not doing it perfectly because like I said, I'm not a native speaker. But the difference is that if it's written IW, it's probably a vowel followed by a consonant. If it's written IU, it's probably just a diphthong. And I mean, you also see it like as actually a sequence of I and then you, like in Judeus for Jew. Um, but then you also see that becoming Judeus with a J, which in like some scribes write it that way. That might be like a later change. Um, so in any case, we either have in the monophthongal pronunciation. Oh crap! I forgot to put an H there, but I'm not re-recording all of this. Um, in the monophthongal pronunciation, we have a vowel not distinguished whether it's short or long, which is already something that we know for that same vowel, because we have it for say as opposed to distinguishing it from a short vowel. Um, and also we have like versus we have u versus u, like in the thu. Um, there is like some weak three verbs were probably like long in the ending, so like liugan versus liugan, where the a could be short or long. But if we assume that Gothic did have diphthongs, the spelling of them does not make any sense. We're like, these diphthongs I, ow. Why would you write them the same as eh, oh? Why would you do that? Um, you could, for example, write this short with an I, write this long with this e, and the same for, this short o. You could write it oo. You could write this oo, and then just keep this spelling, and that would be like more etymological. Obviously, they didn't. We're not always aware of the etymology. They probably weren't. Um, but in terms of distribution, it the distribution would, like, you wouldn't run into any problems with that. You don't have like short e before r. You don't have really any reason to uh, write it like this. Or if you want to keep these written au, ai, you could write these with um, with the awaj, the j like a yod. I guess I could say. I don't really call the letter j yod, but if I'm talking about it as making a yes sound, maybe that's something. I don't know if people would understand that better. Um, but really, I see very little reason to write this as the same when, like, why would you write it the same as the monophthong when you could just write the monophthongs different or the diphthong different? There's nothing preventing you from doing that. The fact that they're written the same strongly indicates that the only difference is whether the vowel is short or long. And oh, compare that to the monophthongal pronunciation, which is the thing about monophthongization is it's very common across the Germanic languages. It probably happened in Vendelic at some point. It probably happened in what I mean. It did happen in Old Saxon and Old High German, and there was a monophthongization in Old English that sort of happened differently. So in Old English, this I becomes ah, and the ow becomes ow, and then later like becomes ah. So it does monophthongize in like Old English, just sort of differently. I It also monophthongizes in Old West Norse, I believe. Um, it's not. It also, like I said, it monophthongizes in Greek and Latin. So you have like the Caesar as opposed to Caesar. So this is a very common sound change. Even in English in modern times, you have monophthongization where some people in like the South might like say like I as um, like I don't know, like rider might be like rider, ra rider, spider for spider. Obviously that's more similar to the change that happened in Old English. Um, but monophthongization of diphthongs is a very common sound change, and writing short vowels and long vowels the same is very common. Writing, monophthongs as diphthongs is very common when you have more vowel sounds than vowel letters. You do see in some languages that they just write both the same. Like, for example, Old High German is believed to both have and e, um, but it was using the Latin script, so that could be the reason why, whereas Gothic has its own script. But in either case, like, you do see, people writing these sounds, like, and we know it happened in Gothic, obviously, because we have, like, words etymologically from a monophthong. So there's really not any reason to say, in my opinion, that they were diphthongs other than that, a cursory glance and like, oh, it comes from Proto-Germanic I ow, and it's written I ow. Like that's, I mean, there are like I said, there is some evidence that some dialects kept it, and the evidence that it was monophthongized from Latin isn't very strong. Um, but we do have these phongs as monophthongs, and in words that are probably, diphthongs in Proto-Germanic, especially that 𝐷����𐌹𐍰, but, maybe that was Vandalic, but it was probably Gothic, I'm pretty sure. In any case, that's like the monophthong versus diphthong debate in Gothic. I hope you can see like why I pronounce them as monophthongs all the time as opposed to like sometimes being diphthongs. Um, and why that's like the main scholarly consensus. I haven't talked about everything here, um, but I think these are like the main reasons. So uh, that's it, I guess.